You are listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place.
Hey y'all, a couple of housekeeping and promotional items before we jump into this episode. First, one more reminder that we'll be at Arcana in Durham, North Carolina at 8 p.m. on Thursday, September 28th. We'll do a live episode plus a Q&A, and we'll have a bunch of swag to hand out, so we'd love to see you there. If you go, remember that the entrance is around back. If you're using a mapping app to get there, look up Arcana's address, 331 West Main Street. You'll see Ramseur Street, aka the downtown loop, on the other side of their block. There's a city parking lot back there, and the entrance to Arcana faces that parking lot. Also, nominations for the WRAL Voters' Choice Awards are open, and we'd love it if you nominated us. There's a link in the show notes. Go to that link, choose Professional and Entertainment, then choose Podcast, and nominate us. Third thing, join Charlie at the South Carolina State Library on Thursday, October 12th at 6 p.m. for an author event celebrating Arcane Carolinas Volume 1. Charlie will share a couple of spooky stories, do a Q&A, and give out a bunch of swag. It'll be in the Learning Lab at 1500, that's 1500 Senate Street in Columbia, South Carolina. Enter the library between the two lions, and registration is required to attend. There's a link in the show notes to this episode in whatever app or site you use to listen, and there's a post on Facebook on the Arcane Carolinas page with all the info. So, go get registered and go hang out with Charlie on the 12th. Thanks for listening, and now, on to the episode.
Hello, and welcome back to Arcane Carolinas Spooky Season 2023. Three.
Yes.
So this one is actually really fun because we plan everything in advance when it comes to how we're going to do these episodes, when we're going to do these episodes, and then life happens and we're out of sync with our schedule that we made ourselves.
Yeah.
And that has given me the opportunity to bring some things up that I wouldn't have otherwise. So I'm actually really grateful for the fact that we're getting to do this today.
Excellent.
We've been getting a lot of emails and messages regarding events and things to do. And normally we do a road tripping episode. We didn't do that this year. So this gives us an opportunity to very quickly off the bat plug some things that I think people might be interested in. Even though I emailed the people back and said, no, our schedule's full. We're not going to be able to talk about that. So here we are. Obviously, Carowinds, if you're out that direction, does what's called Scarowinds through select dates throughout the fall on the weekends. Also, for smaller kids, they do a great pumpkin-themed area, which is awesome. So fun for the whole family there. I will be at the State Library of South Carolina at 6 p.m. on Thursday, October 12th in Columbia, South Carolina. I'll be talking about the new Arcane Carolinas book, sharing a spooky story or two, hanging out. I have reached out to the student newspaper and asked them if they could produce that fabled article about the three-eyed man that everyone swears to me exists that no one can produce. I've reached out to them in the past and not gotten a response, but I reached out this time and was like, hey, I am going to be directly across the street from you.
Fair enough.
Can I look in the archives? Could you just find the article for me? Why don't you just tell me where the article is? And hopefully somebody can cough it up. If not, I'll maintain my stance on that one. So the Arts Factory at West End Studios in Charlotte, North Carolina is hosting a production this fall of a play called The Woman in Black, which is a ghosty play being put on by Proxy Moron Productions. So if you're in Charlotte, that's something spooky to do this fall. Dr. Catherine Laughlin of the City Doctor Productions is hosting historical reenactments in Cary, and it involves a lot of Cary, North Carolina, hidden history and the historic trolley. You can check out her Facebook page, City Doctor Productions, for more details. Looks awesome. She's gotten a lot of good press in the past. And also in Cary, North Carolina is the wonderfully named Cary Corpse Crawl.
Ooh.
Yeah. You know I like alliteration. So info is available at caryghosttours.com. And there are two versions of the tour, which is why I think this is worth mentioning. There's the family-friendly version, And then there's also the spine chilling version. So you can pick your poison if you're into that sort of thing. And there are no jump scares in either. There's some stuff to do this fall, and they're all sort of ghosty. So I thought that would line up with what you were going to talk about today.
Yeah, totally. The thing we're going to talk about today, if you're ready for me to dive in.
Yes.
Then the thing we're going to talk about today is, in the past, for spooky seasons, we've talked about two different versions of the Gray Man of South Carolina. And today we're going to talk about one of the versions of the Gray Lady of South Carolina. And there are actually two Gray Lady of South Carolina stories, but the other one...
And there's two Gray Mans.
Yeah.
Is this one of those situations where you're like, oh, these people, they just belong together? I hope they find each other.
I don't think so, but we'll see. The other version of the Gray Lady is one that I'm still researching, and I'm talking to some folks at a historical society in South Carolina, and we'll see if they can cough up anything, because there is mentioned in several places a legend, but never a description of the legend itself.
Don't you hate that?
At one point, the legend was so common, I'm guessing, that nobody thought to write it down. So I'm hoping that I can find a version of that legend. But at any rate, we're going to talk about the version of the Gray Lady that I can find out stuff about. And this story, we're going to actually do in reverse of our usual order. I'm going to do the history first, and then we're going to talk about the legends, because you really need the history for the legend to make any sense.
Okay.
And that history actually starts with Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr. Do you remember the commercial where the guy was eating peanut butter and couldn't answer the trivia question? He was like, burr, burr. They're like, sir, what is the answer? And it's like, burr, burr.
I do not know that commercial
it was
at all.
For milk or something. It was like, it was like, it was like got milk. And so a guy's like eating a peanut butter sandwich and he's answering historical trivia. And they're like, and the answer is Aaron Burr, and he can't say it because his mouth is full of peanut butter and he needs a glass of milk.
There we go.
All right. Go on, then. Sorry.
No problem. So we are talking about Aaron Burr from Hamilton. And for people who have not seen Hamilton and don't recognize his name, I'll very briefly do some of his history. Burr was a politician and a very successful attorney. He served as vice president of the United States during Thomas Jefferson's first term. I will skip the 2-hour version of Aaron Burr's life. And I will simply say he was a senator from the state of New York in the 1790s. A fun bit of trivia: his maternal grandfather was Jonathan Edwards, who wrote and delivered the sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in case you also had to read that in high school.
I did not know that. Interesting.
Yeah, it's funny, actually. That sermon rather, is, we usually think of it as having been like this real firebrand kind of sermon.
Yeah.
But Edwards was actually described at the time as being very soft-spoken, which I think is even creepier. He's just this dude who would stand up at the front of the church and like tell everybody how damned they were in just like the calmest Vulcan voice.
I know where you're going, and I'm telling you how you're getting there.
1800 was actually the first election where two parties ran against each other in the presidential election, and each party presented a specific ticket for president and vice president. And these days, electors in the Electoral College cast a ballot for president and they cast a ballot for vice president, thanks to the 12th Amendment. And the choices of those electors, depending on the state, are expected to align with the popular vote of that state, or are required to align with the popular vote. And that expected to versus required to differences underlying things like the 2020 election, and also to some degree the tampering charges in Georgia, the fact that that has maybe never been specified in some states. But in 1800 it was even more confusing and informal than that, because the way that it worked was that each elector in the Electoral College simply cast two ballots.
Everybody gets a marble. Go put your marble in the jug.
And everybody had figured out already by 1800 that this created some really awkward potential scenarios, like creating a tie between two presidential candidates. But also,
but they had duels back then, so it's fine.
Right.
There's a tie,
as Aaron Burr demonstrated.
Yeah.
But also there was the potential for a tie between a candidate for president and a candidate for vice president, because those ballots were not specified for which office they were being cast. The deal was that whoever came in first was president, and whoever came in second was vice president. And so
you could accidentally wind up president.
Yes.
Wow.
And even if that didn't happen, the best outcome of the everybody casts 2 ballots system originally in place meant that the vice president was whoever had just lost the election for president. So
no conflicts of interest there.
Right. Definitely automatically right out of the gate a political opponent. But in 1800, they had presented tickets, each party had, and one ticket was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and one ticket was other people. Thomas Jefferson had been the vice president under the incumbent president, Adams, because he came in second in the election of 1796, but they were political enemies. And Jefferson ran again in 1800 with a newly founded political party called the Democratic Republicans, and they won. And they planned to have their electors in the Electoral College cast a full number of ballots for Jefferson and one fewer ballot for Jefferson's vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr. Mm-hmm. So that Jefferson would be president and Burr would be vice president, and there wouldn't be this problem. The election of 1800 was especially vicious, and Burr was one of the main architects of that viciousness. And in fact, he is credited, quote unquote, with having run the first modern campaign for president. And the vitriol and smear campaigns and negative campaigning and all that sort of stuff that we see today was all Aaron Burr's idea 223 years ago.
Thanks, buddy.
When we say that we have never been more divided, it's that we have never had better coverage of our existing divisions. So that plan to have everybody cast one fewer ballot for Burr than for Jefferson didn't work out. And in fact, they tied in the first balloting. And at the time, there were accusations that Burr had campaigned to create that tie because he wanted to steal the presidency in subsequent ballots.
You rascally Burr.
This created a runoff in the House of Representatives, and Jefferson didn't win until the 36th ballot, when a few of the old president's supporters switched sides and voted for Jefferson to get it over with, possibly at the urging of Alexander Hamilton from Hamilton. The end result was that Jefferson was elected president, but only barely, and his new vice president, who had just been his running mate and had run his campaign, was already his most suspected rival. So it was a pretty hostile workplace in the federal government. And this was basically gasoline on the fire of all the existing rivalries that Burr had with basically everyone in federal politics, including Alexander Hamilton, and eventually led to the duel between them. That duel didn't just lead to Hamilton dying. It also killed Burr's political...
Spoiler alert, Michael.
Right. Well, it's an old TV show. But this also led to the end of his political career and the end of his legal career. He had charges against him in New York and in New Jersey. No clients would hire him. None of his old connections in political circles would help him. And so he went, quote unquote, west to the frontier, which was a lot further east back then.
The furthest west he went was Ohio.
He actually did go to Ohio for the
Did he really?
Yeah.
So far west. So west.
Right. He there either became a very ambitious land speculator or he started organizing a secessionist rebellion. Huh. To this day, there are people who believe both sides of that.
Fun.
He always claimed that he was just engaging in land purchases and leases as a new business venture, and he was a very ambitious business person, and often to his detriment. But he also did organize an army, maybe. The letters that were used as evidence against him were written in code by him, and the person who decoded them, quote unquote, was the general to whom he wrote them, and who also was a part of the plot if a plot existed, and regardless himself was tried for treason in an unrelated coup attempt years later. So maybe he's not the world's most reliable source, but he said that he and Burr were part of a plot to make what were then the Western states secede from the Union and form their own nation, and that Burr would be its king.
Spicy times in early American history.
In 1807, Burr was arrested for treason on Jefferson's orders and accused of organizing a plot in which he would do all those things. He actually was accused of trying to convince a big chunk of the Louisiana Purchase to secede and form its own nation with him as its king as well. He was actually arrested and tried for this multiple times, and the federal prosecution against him proceeded at the urging of President Jefferson, despite everyone pretty much agreeing that, yeah, he probably did it, but also that there just wasn't any evidence to prove it in court, other than the word of somebody who was already suspicious himself. Burr got acquitted in each trial, and in the course of one of those trials, the court attempted to order President Jefferson to hand over papers that he said he had that would prove Burr's guilt. But Jefferson refused, saying the president needed to be able to exert control over their own documents if they contained vital state secrets or other dangerous or important information. And that case from 1807 has been cited publicly in the case of Trump's handling of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. So legal opinions from 1807 are still shaping headlines today.
History matters, kids.
It also came up in the Watergate case and basically has been cited anytime a president has said, nobody should be able to look at that because that was from when I was president. But ultimately, the outcome of this was that the courts said anything that isn't purely personal sort of leaves the president's control and authority once they're no longer in a position of authority. The end result of all of this was that Burr left the U.S. altogether, went to England, tried to buddy up with politicos there and talk up maybe taking back the colonies.
I'm going to be the king of England now.
He got kicked out of England for that. He moved to France and he lived there for the next several years, all of which left his only heir in something of a bad situation.
Yeah.
That heir was his daughter named Theodosia Burr. She was the daughter and only child of Aaron Burr and his wife, who was also named Theodosia. Theodosia was named for her mother. And so from this point forward, I will refer to Aaron Burr's wife as Mrs. Burr because that's really confusing. Mrs. Burr was an extremely gifted intellectual and exceptionally well-educated. There are plenty of people who believed at the time and believe ever since that she was probably the best educated woman and one of the best educated people of her era. And that probably Burr never would have wound up in all of the trouble that he did if she had still been around, because she was clearly the brains of the operation. She was just much smarter than he was, reportedly, much better educated than he was, and just better at navigating politics. But Theodosia, their daughter, was born on June 21st, 1783, and then her mother died when Theodosia was only 11. And thus, she was not around for later years of Burr's career when he ran into all sorts of problems.
It sounds like he just started getting all wild.
Yeah, he kind of did. At the point that his wife died, Aaron Burr became a very strict father and what one might call rigorous in overseeing her education. Theodosia learned multiple languages. She learned advanced mathematics. She studied the arts. And as a young teenager, she also served as the social hostess for her father's business dinners and social occasions. Burr traveled a lot as part of his legal career and as part of his political career. And so Theodosia was effectively the head of the household starting at like age 10.
Wow.
And she was the hostess for dinners and banquets and parties and fundraisers and everything while he was out doing stuff as a politician and as an attorney. But they wrote each other all the time. And he was the sort of parent, if this tells you anything, who would return her letters to her marked with corrections and suggested improvements.
Yes, Theodosia, your grammar is lacking. More the Oxford comma, blah, 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 blah.
That's not necessarily that far off.
Daddy, I'm 10. Please be easy on me.
That said, Burr was one of very few men at the time to advocate openly for the education and liberation of women. He had read a book published in 1792, written by a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft. That book was titled A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And after that, he declared that he would see that Theodosia was educated to the same standard as he would hold any son. And so that was responsible for a lot of him making sure that she was very highly educated. At the time, the Burr family lived on a 26-acre estate on the island of Manhattan called Richmond Hill, a mile and a half from what was then the edge of New York City. This was during the era when there were like farms and plantations and countryside on Manhattan. And so the Burr estate was actually most easily reached by a footpath that crossed a bunch of fields and a stream and had like a little log bridge and all kinds of very picturesque stuff. And it was just this like farmland out there in what today is Greenwich Village in New York City. These days, the only remaining part of the estate is its carriage house, which is a restaurant in Greenwich Village. And that restaurant is called Barrow Street Ale House. And if you look it up on Google Maps, then there's a giant truck in the way. But if you move around, you can get to where you can see the front of it from an angle. And it's if you're just walking by, it would just look like another storefront in Manhattan. But if you look at the top of the building, you can see that this is a visibly different style of building from all the other New York City downtown around.
Interesting.
Yeah. Even once the city built out that far and began to surround and replace that estate, the neighborhood was still called Richmond Hill for a long time before it came to be associated with the name Greenwich Village, which also existed at the time. Theodosia, however, she married in 1801, and her husband was a very wealthy plantation owner named Joseph Alston. Alston was young, he was extremely rich, and he was very ambitious. And every book and article and website that I read pointed out that this very likely was not entirely a marriage of affection, or at least not solely a marriage of affection, as Aaron Burr was having massive money problems. He was deeply in debt. He was like tens of thousands of dollars in debt in the 1790s. So this is fortune upon fortune that he owes after a bunch of failed business deals. And he had a ton of real estate deals fall apart on him before he could see any profit out of them, but after the point where he had gone into debt to try to make them happen. So he was having a lot of issues. There is a lot of supposition that he sort of married Theodosia off to a very rich Southerner so that he could tap into that family's money. But personally, I'm not really sure that I buy that as the sole explanation because, yeah, Burr was notoriously desperate for money, but also he seemed really genuinely committed to Theodosia's agency. Mm-hmm. And there are letters that survive between her and her husband that suggest real warmth and real affection. And she also wrote to her father later that they had formed, as she put it, an affectionate alliance. So I think that maybe they went into it as like, this would be smart, but also maybe we like each other. And then it worked out.
Good for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, good for them.
I also don't totally buy that Theodosia and Alston's marriage was purely a financial convenience, because Theodosia and her father's letters to each other included extensive and what I will call very frank discussion of romantic and sexual matters on both their parts. And I've read that her letters reflecting real feeling for her husband are enthusiastic on that front. And at the same time, her father was writing her letters about his extensive career of romantic affairs following her mother's death. So they were sharing a lot as father and daughter. And the things that she was sharing were a lot. Also, there was some supposition that their marriage was a purely political alliance on Alston's part because he wanted to enter politics, but he was worried that he was too obviously seen as just like the rich kid of a Southern aristocrat, and that might harm him in electoral politics, even in his native South Carolina, and that he was marrying somebody who was more politically respectable as a way to sort of attach himself to that political respectability. But this was all before the duel with Hamilton. This was before everything that had gone down. And it was believable at the time to think that Aaron Burr was somebody you could hitch your wagon to.
Sure.
Theodosia and Alston honeymooned in Niagara Falls, and they are the first recorded couple to do so. That is something that the museum at Niagara Falls touts as they were the first couple to go there for their honeymoon.
Have you ever been to Niagara Falls?
No, it's where my parents had their honeymoon. So
I went up to Niagara Falls because I was like, I want to see it. Right. So I went up there, and the American side is not good.
Really?
Yeah. It's really, really, really built up. The falls themselves are great.
Yeah. I've always heard the Canadian side is the pretty side.
Yeah. Niagara Falls. It's a place to go. No offense to anybody that really, really likes Niagara Falls.
There's little mini Arcane destinations.
Yeah. Oh, the highlight of the trip, well, the falls themselves were the highlight of the trip, right? But the second highlight of the trip was on the Canadian side. I went to an IHOP. I wanted to go to an actually international house of pancakes.
Okay.
And the O, inside the O, where it would normally just be a circle, it was in the shape of a maple leaf.
Oh, wow. There you go. All right.
Anyway, so they go to Niagara Falls.
They went to Niagara Falls. They had one son, whom they named Aaron Burr Alston. So the names in this get even more confusing. He was born in 1802, and Theodosia really threw herself into being a devoted and attentive mother. Alston was a South Carolinian. He owned a plantation called the Oaks in Georgetown, South Carolina. And he wanted to enter South Carolina politics. And he did as soon as they were married and their son was born. And so tragically, her life in South Carolina was actually extremely lonely.
Mm-hmm.
she had spent her childhood in New York City, and her teen years was as the hostess of a socially prominent estate with endless dinner parties and banquets and formal affairs. And now she lived in rural South Carolina as the wife of a plantation owner who spent all of his time in Columbia because he had just been elected Speaker of the State House in the South Carolina legislature. Theodosia's life also was made more difficult by a downturn in her health. She never really recovered after giving birth to their son, and she spent the next several years traveling to New York on occasion, either to spend time at various health spas in upstate New York or visiting her father. And these trips were all in the name of hopefully getting her strength back, because she just didn't have a lot in the way of endurance at that point. Okay. And she almost always took her son along on those trips. In fact, she and her son were with her father in 1806 when he made the trip to Ohio that later was presented as one of the organizing trips for his alleged treason. And given how close they were, I think it's pretty safe to say that Theodosia could have said definitively whether those allegations were or were not true, but we'll never know. When Burr stood trial for treason in 1807, his trial, the federal trial, was in Richmond, Virginia. And she traveled there from South Carolina to be with him, took her son with her. They were all there to support Aaron Burr. And after he left the country following that trial, she spent years fundraising for her father, sending him money, and campaigning with the federal government and with notable figures like the wives and children of Revolutionary War heroes and folks like that to try to make it possible for her father to return to the United States and it be not a dramatic affair. And throughout this, she and he were still exchanging letters, including ones where he was detailing his many romantic affairs in Europe. So things were definitely very normal between them. But in June of 1812, Theodosia's son died of malaria, which we've discussed many times as being endemic in that part of South Carolina at the time. And Theodosia was completely shattered. Her whole life had been about raising her son and trying to help her father come back to the United States so she could see him again. And just as her father was set to get to return, her child passed away. So she, due to a serious downturn in her health in the wake of that, had to cancel a planned trip to New York in July of 1812 to greet her father when he returned. And she had to try to recover her health enough to be able to travel in the first place. And that rescheduled trip from Georgetown, South Carolina to New York City was set for December of 1812. Right before the trip, her husband, Alston, had been elected and sworn in as governor of South Carolina. And the War of 1812 had started, and he was the commander of the state's militia. So he could not leave the state and travel with her to New York City. He had to send her on her own. The war meant that British ships were patrolling the coast of the United States, disrupting shipping and travel, and frequently stopping ships, especially those going from the coast of South Carolina, which was basically the economic engine of the new country, headed for the Northeast. And travel by land, especially in the middle of winter, would have taken a lot longer, been a lot more open to problems, potential health hazards, things like that. So there wasn't really a good way to get from Georgetown, South Carolina, to New York City at the close of 1812, but Theodosia was determined that she was going to go see her father, and so she opted to travel by sea. In order to make the trip as quickly as possible, though, she booked passage aboard a schooner called Patriot. That ship was renowned for possibly being the fastest ship of its size in the United States at the time, and also for being operated as one of the most successful privateers in service to the United States. The U.S. government had commissioned Patriot and her captain earlier that same year as a privateer to act as an officially licensed pirate. And they had targeted those British patrols and British shipping, and they had reconfigured it to disguise its purpose. They'd moved the guns below decks. They had painted over the name on the side of it, all kinds of stuff. They'd fudged a bunch of paperwork so that it wasn't necessarily identifiable or identified. And it was basically a different ship altogether by the time Theodosia was set to travel from Georgetown, South Carolina to New York City aboard it. It has also been speculated that the same trip was being used to ship goods to the Northeast that Patriot had taken from British ships in the course of its privateering. And so the ship, just by itself, would have made a really attractive target at the time. Yeah. But if you assume that it's also laden with the bounty of privateering, then it becomes even more attractive as a target.
Doubly.
So Theodosia sets out aboard the Patriot on New Year's Eve of 1812. expected to arrive in New York City like a week later, maybe. The trip was only supposed to take a few days. Alston, her husband, sent a doctor friend along with her to kind of watch over her health. And he also wrote a letter and had her carry it with her. And that letter reportedly was a plea to any pirates or any British naval ships that might encounter them, asking that they be allowed to continue unbothered due to his wife's failing health. Because at that point, it had become pretty clear that Theodosia's illness was probably terminal and that she was going to die sooner rather than later. I have seen it speculated in some of the stories that she had cancer of some variety, and stomach and other gastrointestinal cancers were not uncommon at the time, in part due to exposures to carcinogens and toxins and things like that in food supplies and in food preparation and all kinds of things. That's one of the things that's speculated to have been what caused H.P. Lovecraft to die, for instance. So it's not at all uncommon, and it would have been in many ways very mysterious to people at the time, and they would have had absolutely nothing they could do about it. But she set off from Georgetown, South Carolina on Patriot on December 31st, 1812, and that was the last time anyone saw Theodosia alive. Patriot never arrived in New York City, and after several weeks of waiting for word, both Alston and Burr publicly declared that they believed that Theodosia had died in a shipwreck.
Yeah.
The coast of North Carolina was, in fact, at the time already called the Graveyard of the Atlantic. And immediately after Theodosia's disappearance, the rumors and the folklore about her death started.
North Carolina coast. We're number one. We're number one.
Thus, Theodosia Burr became the Gray Lady of various places.
Ooh. Multiple
Legend
places.
of Theodosia's disappearance was an early object of fascination and speculation for popular writers of the early and the later 19th century and even into the early 20th century. And she kind of took on this aspect of like one part Blackbeard's ghost, one part Virginia Dare, of the day. She pops up all over the place in different stories. There is even a legend that claims that Patriot somehow wound up off the coast of Texas and that she wound up there marrying a Native American chieftain, et cetera. So there are a lot of stories about
the many adventures of Theodosia Burr.
Yeah, she's a real Carmen Sandiego character. But there were rumors that pirates had kidnapped Theodosia at the time. There were rumors that pirates had kidnapped Theodosia and were holding her for ransom. But Aaron Burr and Governor Alston both dismissed those as untrue. There were also rumors that Patriot had fallen victim to an illegal practice some residents of Nags Head, North Carolina, and other parts of the Outer Banks engaged in, called wrecking or banking. In that practice, they would tie a lantern to a horse and use that to lure a ship close to shore by making it think the lantern was the light on a safely anchored ship. That would cause the lured-in ship to wreck. Then the wreckers or bankers would kill the crew and passengers, take the cargo. And this was especially common around Nags Head because it didn't yet have a lighthouse at the time.
Land pirates.
Land pirates, yes. And that's what they were referred to as.
Cool. I mean, it's not cool. It's bad, but it's cool.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Ironically, Alexander Hamilton, the person Aaron Burr had killed, had successfully lobbied for building lighthouses along the coast of North Carolina, specifically due to its reputation, but one had not yet been built in Nags Head, which is why this was practiced there. Some of these rumors manifested in popular fiction, and some manifested in that era's equivalent of copy pasta, which somebody pointed out is actually already a term, and I appreciate that. I appreciate knowing that I did not invent that word because it's too useful a word. I'm really glad that lots of other people have already thought of it. But namely, Theodosia's story cropped up in columns in popular newspapers at the time and in ghost lore that was told sort of down through the ages and up to today. For instance, several writers in the 19th and the early 20th century tried to link Theodosia to an Alexandria, Virginia legend called the Female Stranger. It's a long story. I'm not going to dive into it all, but it's about an anonymous woman who died in an inn in Alexandria, Virginia in 1816 with her husband supposedly by her side, but maybe he was also weirdly disinterested. And the woman was buried in a grave marked with an elaborate and equally mysterious inscription. And that legend itself is this whole story that I'm just not going to go into. Suffice to say, the years don't line up, and it doesn't really make any sense to try to say that Theodosia would have run away from her life and lived as someone else for 4 years and then died in an inn in Alexandria, Virginia. So I don't buy it. But that is the first instance often of Theodosia being cited as the Gray Lady of some place. And that female stranger, whoever she was, is reputed to haunt the room at the inn where she died. And that inn is still standing in that room as a destination for ghost hunters. So I found that interesting. There is also a version told in the early 20th century in which the body of an anonymous but obviously well-to-do young woman washed ashore in Cape Charles, Virginia, and was buried on the farm of the family who found her in the absence of knowing who she was, and that this happened in January of 1813. But there's no real way to know whether that happened or to determine whether there is any truth to that. And that story was told by somebody who was very elderly at the very beginning of the 20th century and claimed to have seen this as a child. So who knows? There's zero other corroboration of that story. But there is an associated legend of the spirit of a woman in gray who walks the coast in Cape Charles, Virginia, searching for a way back home.
Okay.
There is also a legend that the spirit of a woman in gray wanders the coast near Georgetown, South Carolina, and is generally believed to be Theodosia's ghost looking for her son on the beaches they frequented when he was alive, which is a particularly affecting version of the story. And it is the first one that I found that I was like, actually, I would maybe buy that.
Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah. There are even ghost stories attached to that old Richmond Hill carriage house that is now Barrow Street Ale House.
Really?
Yes. Before it became Barrow Street Ale House, it was a restaurant called One If by Land, Two If by Sea.
It's a great name for a restaurant.
Yeah. And the staff of that restaurant repeatedly told stories of glasses being thrown across the room and smashed, trays of food being knocked over, silverware getting thrown around, you name it, all the typical haunted restaurant stuff. Chairs getting yanked out from under people, that kind of thing. And those were credited to being the ghost of Aaron Burr, whose staff said was angry that his old estate was gone and that his carriage house had been taken over by common folk. But they also reported seeing the ghost of a mysterious young woman in gray and came to believe that that was the spirit of Theodosia trying to go back home to see her father one last time. And I like that version too.
It's not awful. Not awful.
In one of the most widespread examples of Theodosia's legend entering the mainstream, a Louisiana writer named, and he has a French name, and so I'm going to mess it up. I'm just going to say that. But I think that it is pronounced Charles Gairet, wrote a book that he himself described as, quote, truth mixed with fiction. In that book, he claimed that a well-known French pirate of the era admitted to having boarded Patriot after finding it following a storm, that the ship had been damaged in a storm and that he was no longer able to sail, and that they found it drifting. He and his crew boarded Patriot and killed all the male passengers and the crew of the ship and forced Theodosia Burr to walk the plank off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. However, this account of her walking the plank is just wildly romanticized. And it has stuff like how elegantly she stepped from the plank and, you know, how dignified she was.
And she floated down like Princess Peach in Mario 2.
Right. You know, and that like as she sank beneath the waves, she waved at them as if to say thank you and goodbye, you know, and like all this stuff that makes zero sense. And also, Gairet was a white supremacist and political agitator and a fan of Aaron Burr, who wrote exposés of the people who had accused Burr of treason, but he wrote them like 70 years later. He was somebody who was really wanting to reach back into the historical record and revise people's opinions.
Gotcha. So he had a motivation to make the Burrs look a certain way.
Exactly. Yeah. And there is plenty of reason to think that he would have fabricated a noble and tragic end for Theodosia as a way of framing Aaron Burr as having, you know, yet again been unfairly, unjustly wronged. That said, there are stories that float around, and I could not find a confirmation of this one, that a woman filed a sworn statement late in the 19th century claiming that she had been present at the deathbed confession of a different pirate who in turn claimed that he was part of that attack on the crew and passengers of Patriot. and that the pirates took most of the cargo from Patriot, but that they left the belongings of a woman that they made to walk the plank. And further, the woman who made this account, like the woman who made this sworn statement late in the 19th century, claimed that also she had been there when a group of wreckers in Nag's Head found Patriot after it washed ashore after that pirate attack. And in the loot from the ship that they kept, they had found a bunch of very fine women's clothing and a portrait of a beautiful woman.
I knew there was something with a portrait. Like, I knew there was something with a portrait with her. I've been biting my tongue like, don't ask about the painting. Don't ask about the painting. Don't ask about the painting.
Yeah, the rest of this is about the painting.
Okay.
She said that that was what they salvaged from the wreckage. And in this version of things, the pirate whose confession the woman heard said that the woman made to walk the plank had a name that he couldn't quite recall, but it was something like Odessa Burr. That's compelling, but that's a pretty long chain of I was there, you know, in order to go believing it. But in that version of the legend, the spirit of the woman from the painting walks the beaches at night searching for her lost portrait, and the ghost is generally assumed to be Theodosia Burr.
Okay, I like it. Kind of.
This version was first popularized by being published in a book of folklore, not entirely unlike the ones by, say, Charles Wedby. And so I find it kind of especially sus. Given the level of detail combined with the many decades between its publication and the supposed events recounted in this chain of confessions and hypothetical sworn statements, and that there's no way to check any of this, kind of feel like it's...
So here's a funny story. When you start getting a certain amount of time away from events, when people make claims, you start to deconstruct them. I don't know if this person listens to the show or not. I know a guy, haven't talked to him in years. He always said, my uncle took me to see Nirvana at a club before they were big. And you do the math on how old this 9-year-old, 10-year-old would have been admitted to a club. There's no way. There's absolutely no way. Yeah. Now, that's a somewhat, you know, obviously a different example. But once you start getting people that are like, oh, 20, 30 years ago, somebody told me this thing, or I saw this thing. It's like, you never mentioned it before now? What? And it's suddenly relevant to the story. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
When the distance in time starts to stack up.
I still buy it.
No.
There's an alternate version of the same story, by the way, in which the ship washed ashore with Theodosia still on board as the only person on board, and the painting as her only possession, because she had been driven mad by the pirate attack and the pirates had thus abandoned her. I especially do not buy that version.
She's crazy. Leave her with her painting.
Yeah. But it turns out the part about the portrait actually has legs. According to the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, housed at UNC Chapel Hill's Wilson Library, and according to the historian for Pasquotank County, North Carolina, in 1869, a doctor named William Poole was called to the seaside cabin of an elderly widow named Polly Mann, who lived in Nags Head, North Carolina. Mann was visibly quite poor, so Dr. Poole couldn't help but notice the extremely valuable-looking portrait of a beautiful young woman hanging on the wall of her cabin and asked her about it. Mann told Poole that many decades before, a boyfriend of hers, who had been a wrecker, had taken that portrait and 2 very nice black dresses from a shipwreck that had washed ashore in Nag's Head and given them to her, Mann, as a gift, and that she had had the portrait ever since.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And in fact, the portrait was the only thing of value, monetarily, that she had. So she offered it to Dr. Poole as payment for his medical services. In some versions of the story, the woman turns out to be Theodosia, and elderly, and also maybe like half insane. And that is pure fiction.
Okay. Yeah, I knew there was a story involving a painting, and like, this is great to actually hear it.
In other versions, the doctor saved Mann from certain death, and in her gratitude, she makes him take this painting despite it being way more than what he would normally charge. But regardless, Mann was real, Poole was real, and the painting really did get given to Dr. Poole. Dr. Poole took that portrait and, hearing the story, subsequently began to wonder if that portrait was Theodosia Burr Alston, because that story, like I said, had entered popular culture and had stayed popular. So he started tracking down some of her living relatives and asking them to look at it and tell them, is this Theodosia? The painting does bear an obvious resemblance to other portraits of Theodosia that we know were of Theodosia. And she was said at the time to be taking with her to New York a new portrait she had had commissioned to give to her father as a welcome home gift. Almost none of the relatives of Theodosia that Poole could track down had ever met her, because this was decades later.
Right.
So they all said, well, that looks like portraits of her, but we never saw her in person, so we can't really say. He was able to find one person who had met her, and that was her sister-in-law, who by then was a very elderly woman, and looked at the portrait and said she wasn't sure. In some versions, she said that's definitely not Theodosia. In other versions, she said that might be Theodosia. There's a lot of confusion around what she said or what she didn't say, but she definitely didn't say, yeah, that's her. But Poole decided it probably was Theodosia. And in the end, he donated it to the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, where it hangs today. And you can go see it. And when you look at that portrait and a portrait of someone we know was Theodosia, they don't look exactly the same, but they sure do look similar. And it's awfully tempting to put my money on that's a real painting of Theodosia.
I like it. Yes. I say yes. We do it.
If it is.
I'm throwing the Arcane Carolinas endorsement behind that one.
If that is a portrait of Theodosia, then a bunch of the legends told about her for over 200 years just might actually be based on something true.
Which is why I'm throwing my endorsement behind. I want to believe.
So maybe the Gray Lady of Georgetown, South Carolina is Theodosia. And maybe the Gray Lady of Nags Head, North Carolina is Theodosia. And maybe the Gray Lady of Cape Charles, Virginia is Theodosia. And maybe the Gray Lady of the Barrow Street Ale House in New York City is Theodosia. And maybe one or any or all of those are Theodosia Burr trying to return to some happier time in her life, whether it's with her son or with her husband or with her father.
So this is what we do. We schedule a Gray Ladies meetup and we see who shows up.
We have to go to each of those places with a medium.
Mm-hmm. Give them the invitation.
And you're right. Yeah.
And then at the event, if a bunch of people show up, then we know, oh, they're all different Gray Ladies. But if only Theodosia shows up, then we know we've solved it.
And then we'll compare her to the picture of Theodosia.
Yes.
And to the painting.
This is an excellent plan. Very feasible.
There you go. But that's the story of one of the Gray Ladies of South Carolina, Theodosia Burr Alston.
We got to get the Gray Ladies together with the Gray Men. They'd hit it off. It'd be good. They'd be like, are you spectral and gray in a general geographic region?
Is your identity a subject of controversial belief?
Yeah, we have so much to talk about.
There's a lot in common there.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, that's just the starter conversation. They'll eventually get into exchanging racy letters and stuff like that.
Just like the whole thing about Aaron Burr sending his daughter letters about his affairs, it's very distressing to me. That is like more information than I wanted.
It's not appropriate. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your patience with a whole bunch of chaos getting it recorded.
They don't know about that.
Talk to you later.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. For more episodes, behind-the-scenes information, and links to our social media, check out www.arcanecarolinas.com, where you can also buy the Arcane Carolinas book.
And if you like award-winning horror and science fiction, check out my books at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com or visit my publisher, Falstaff Books, at falstaffbooks.com. And if you have story suggestions, comments, or questions, email us at arcanecarolinas@gmail.com. And thanks for listening.
What are you talking about, Michael? There was no interruption. We didn't edit anything. Everything was. This is a completely natural starting point from the end of your last sentence.
Absolutely.
That's a good stinger.
Yes.
Maybe not the part where I say that's a good stinger.
No, I think that makes it even funnier. In fact, no, this is all the stinger.